It's my great honor this evening to welcome you all here, distinguished family members, friends, colleagues and students, to the annual Hans Heilbronner Lecture. Among many other things, Hans Heilbronner was a professor of history here for many years. My colleague Professor Marla Brettschneider will say more about him, but I just want to, in my remarks, to welcome you here on this important week in our history and an important event where we all can come together for a very interesting lecture tonight. I want in particular to welcome Hans's widow Phyllis and his sons Warren and Robert, who are here with us, so we're delighted to have them here. Some have traveled longer distances than others, I gather. I would also like to say how happy I am to see Professor Jeff Dierendorf and his wife Barbara back here. Welcome to both of you. And I would also like to acknowledge family friends of the Heilbronners, David and Leslie Schwartz and Robert and Cindy Shaken, all of whom generously established and continue to support the Endowed Fund for Holocaust Education, which underwrites the Heilbronner Lecture Series. And I also want to thank Daniel Mary Oshin for his ongoing support to the fund. I'm looking forward to a wonderful evening. Thank you again for being here. And now I'll invite Professor Marla Brettschneider to please come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So am I just fine to be? Excellent. Do I need a mic? I don't think I need one. Good evening. This is a solemn and important event that we do every year, and of course this year is even tougher, so we're really glad to have you all here. As you heard, the event is sponsored by the UNH Endowment for Holocaust Education, and we're so grateful for the people already named, wonderful active donors and contributors to the Hans Heilbronner Lecture and Professor Jeffrey Diefendorf for the education of UNH students, faculty, staff, and community. And in case you weren't aware, why November 1st? We do this lecture at this time every year to commemorate what is known in German as Kristallnacht. In English, we call that the Night of Broken Glass. It was a watershed moment in growing Nazi power, as Nazis then built methods of systemic and coordinated terror, destruction, and genocide. And on this night, in early November 1939, Nazis in Germany torched synagogues, vandalized Jewish homes, schools, and businesses, and killed dozens of Jews around the country. And we also, you're all well aware, extra heavy hearts this year to take a moment to honor those murdered this past week in the United States in targeted group hate crimes. Of course, individuals are being targeted all the time in our country, but in particular 2 African Americans at a supermarket and the 11 Jews at a Shabbat morning service, which was following the annual National HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society Shabbat, to raise awareness for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. The synagogue that was targeted, many of you know in English, Tree of Life. In Hebrew, that's Eitz Chaim. And it comes from this passage, Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba, v'tamchei checha mushar, darcheya darchei noam, l'chol v'tivotecha shalom, which means, she is a tree of life for those who hold fast to her. Her ways are pleasant and her pathways are peace. And that's where the title of the synagogue that was targeted gets its name, Eitz Chaim. What we're going to do is take a moment. I'm going to call up 13 folks from the audience, you know who you are, to come up here. When we all get here, we're going to take a solemn moment of remembrance in silence. We'll read each name. When everybody's up here, we'll ask you to stand, so give us a moment. Thank you. So if you would give all of these people the honor of standing, please. David will begin.
Vicky Lee Jones.
Maurice Stallard.
Joyce Feinberg.
Richard Godfrey.
Cecil Rosenthal.
Jerry Rabinowitz.
David Rosenthal.
Bernice Simon.
Sylvan Simon.
Rose Mallinger.
Daniel Stein.
Melvin Watts.
Irving Young.
Thank you. So I also have the pleasure of saying a few more things about Hans Heilbronner and the Heilbronner Lecture series. This memorial lecture that we do each year honors the memory of Hans Heilbronner, professor of history here in the University of New Hampshire, who served with distinction for 37 years, from 1954 to 1991. Hans was born in 1926 in Meiningen, Germany, and died here while living locally in 2011. From 1932 to 39, Hans Heilbronner experienced intensifying anti-Jewish persecution by Germans. In March 39, he and his brother successfully fled Germany to Switzerland. His father, however, had been in a death camp, Dachau. He actually made it out and was reunited with his family. The family then gained temporary admission to England one day before the formal outbreak of World War II. This experience profoundly impacted Hans Heilbronner and shaped his life. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1944 to be admitted to the Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning. The Army actually prevailed upon a federal judge to grant him early U.S. citizenship, which led to his graduation as a second lieutenant at the age of just 18. And he ultimately served as a first lieutenant until August 1946. After the war, Heilbronner entered the University of Michigan under the GI Bill, graduating in 1949 with a BA in history and membership in Phi Beta Kappa. In 1950, he earned his master's degree, was recalled to active duty during the Korean War, and later returned to the University of Michigan to conclude work for a doctorate in Russian history. We have had more than a dozen lectures so far in this series, and even though Michelle said it, I'm going to say it again, Dean Dillon, we are so delighted to have Phyllis, Hans's widow, his wife, and his two sons, Warren and Robert, here with us this year. That's very special to us. We are also so pleased to have Jeffrey Diefendorf and his wife Barbara with us. Jeff served with distinction as a history professor from 1976, retiring only recently in 2017 with over 40 years of distinguished service. We seek to carry on Jeff's legacy with the Holocaust Education Fund and this Heilbronner Lecture Series. We aim to encourage and support UNH, student, faculty, and staff interest in the Nazi Holocaust, and to commemorate and to connect in meaningful ways with the local community. I'm now going to invite up Professor from History, Kirk Dorsey, who will introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Marla. It's my pleasure to introduce Laurel Leff, our speaker for tonight. She's an associate professor of journalism and associate director of Jewish studies at Northeastern University in Boston. Professor Leff has a master's in the study of law from Yale University and a master's in communication from the University of Miami. She received an AB from Princeton University with a major in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. And she's been a reporter or editor for such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the Miami Herald, and the Hartford Courant. Her prize-winning book, Buried by the Times, The Holocaust in America's Most Important Newspaper, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2005. and she's currently researching the response of American elites to pleas to rescue European Jews during the 1930s and 1940s. Her latest book will be published by Yale University Press in about a year, titled Well Worth Saving: American Universities' Life and Death Decisions on Hiring Scholars Fleeing Nazi Europe. Professor Leff is also project director of a digital humanities project, Rediscovering Refugee Scholars. And that project is collecting data and designing a website to chronicle the lives of about 5,000 European scholars who lost their jobs during the Nazi era and sought positions with American universities. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Laurel Leff, who will tell us about lessons from the last time we had an America First agenda in the United States. Professor Leff.
So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure everyone can hear me, and it seems like this mic is not working, so I probably need, yeah, let me take this, that's fine. Oops, and now this is okay, great. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It was really nice to hear about the history of this lecture and the history of the Heilbronner family, and I'm hoping to have further discussions about their experiences in Europe, because as you heard from the introduction, I'm very interested in the process of people migrating from Germany during this era and trying to come to the United States, not always with success. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about directly tonight. I will admit this is a difficult lecture to deliver. And when I started thinking about this, and I actually wrote those words 2 weeks ago, I meant one thing. And what I meant then was that I was able to research the last America First era and to take on the sorrow that is involved in it because I thought of it as history. I never imagined that we would be talking about another one. And so that's what I first thought of when I thought how hard it was to deliver this lecture. But now, tragically, I mean something different. As we just memorialized, 11 Jews were gunned down while worshiping in Pittsburgh, and 6 more people were wounded. And of course, 2 African Americans had been shot the previous week because of a hate crime. And I know we're all struggling to understand what that means. We know it's a personal cataclysm for their families and friends. We know a hole has been ripped in the heart of a wonderful Jewish community, which I know well. But we don't know what it means for and about our nation. Is this the beginning of a long, dark path, or a detour from which we will return to the right and righteous road? We don't know. I don't know. What I do know is that the slaughter in Squirrel Hill is connected to this America First era we find ourselves in. And that means understanding the first America First era is even more important than ever. So let's start with some definitions. America First means 2 things. First, it was a specific movement with specific goals that rose at the beginning of the Second World War. But it's also an attitude and an approach to encountering the world. Of course, the United States, like most, if not all, nation states, puts its own interests ahead of others. But America First means more than that. It means putting Americans' interests first to the exclusion of all other interests, to the denial of the needs and concerns of other nations and other people. It also means a very specific definition of America, a static America, perhaps even a mythic America. So let's start with the America First as a movement. The America First Committee officially formed in 1940, though it had antecedents throughout the 1930s. It formed after Germany had invaded Poland and gone to war with Britain and France, but before the United States was involved. The committee's purpose was, as the name suggests, to ensure that the United States stay out of foreign entanglements, particularly European entanglements. And this was not a totally crazy notion, right? Just 2 decades earlier, the United States had been drawn into a great and bloody war in Europe at an immense cost of life, and without, as public opinion increasingly registered, a real purpose. So when Adolf Hitler, who had become Chancellor of Germany in 1933, started making warlike noises and then taking warlike actions, several influential Americans, mostly from the right, but some from the left as well. There was a strong pacifist movement that was part of the American First movement as well, came together to try and prevent our government from intervening in European affairs. There was an essential problem, however. Hitler was intent on world conquest. Hitler was rearming, moving into the Sudetenland, annexing Austria, invading Czechoslovakia and Poland, and then almost all of Western Europe. So to maintain a non-interventionist stance, one either had to pretend Hitler wasn't doing what Hitler was doing, or one had to be overtly or covertly in sympathy with it. It also meant that one had to overlook or be overtly or covertly in sympathy with what the Nazis were doing in Germany. There was more than enough information for Americans to know that Nazi Germany was a state built on terror, oppression of all opponents, and the most extreme form of persecution, particularly of Jews. So those who argued for America First had to deny or downplay what was right in front of their eyes. They lied either because their other goals, keeping the United States out of war, maintaining business or other ties to Germany, and that's actually an important point, and maybe in the discussion we could come back to it, but America's had a lot of important connections to Germany. So there were a lot of people in business and within universities who were very reluctant to give up on the idea of the old Germany, the Germany that they could do business with, have interactions with, and it was very hard for them to let go of that idea. So there were some people who either decided that those goals were more important, or they actually admired the Nazi regime, or some combination of both. And that was sort of who made up, I think, the America First movement. But that brings us to the second part of the America First movement. America First didn't just mean Americans should stay out of European affairs. It also meant Europeans, and specifically European Jews, should stay out of America. Now, this isn't quite as clear as America First non-interventionist sympathies. America First hid, to some extent, their anti-Semitic motivations. They often claim they objected to all foreigners coming to the United States, not just or necessarily Jews, foreigners who would change the essential culture of the United States. But of course, what they meant by essential culture was white, Protestant, Northern European culture. There was also an essential connection between America First's desire to prevent US intervention in Europe and its anti-Semitic sentiments. America Firsters argued that Jews specifically sought to draw the United States into European affairs. In its more benign expression, the argument was that Jews were trying to get the United States involved in a European war in order to protect their German brethren. So that was kind of the benign expression of this. In its more sinister manifestation, the argument was that an international Jewish conspiracy was seeking to destroy the world. So what are the parallels between this era and our own, and what lessons can we learn from the earlier era? I think the first thing that I want to say is that we don't need to stretch to apply the label America First to this era, the one we are now living in. The president regularly uses the term, including in his inaugural address. Even if the president wasn't evoking the specific historical analogy, however, his approach reflects the American First philosophy: rejection of international agreements, opposition to immigration, support for extreme nationalism. Now, one could speak for hours on each of those topics, on the rejection of international agreements, on the opposition to immigration, the support for nationalism, but I'm going to focus on what America First meant for Jews in the 1930s and 1940s, and what it meant and what it might mean for Jews in the 21st century. Because of course, as Marla explained, we are now commemorating Kristallnacht, the destruction of Jewish synagogues. So that's the part that we're going to emphasize, although of course all the rest of it is as important. So I'm going to start with, I think, a fundamental fact, which is that anti-immigration policies contributed to the death of hundreds of thousands of Jews who were denied entry to the United States. One of the many reasons I'm very eager to talk to the Heilbronner family is because every German Jew, every Austrian Jew, basically every Jew who lived in Europe has some sort of story about trying to escape, about how they tried to get out of Europe at this point. And there's no question that the United States' inhospitality to immigrants meant that many of them could not leave. Now, to some extent, their fate was sealed in the earlier decade, in the 1920s, when the US Congress ended what had been almost unrestricted immigration. Over 1 million immigrants a year arrived in the United States in the first decades of the 20th century, including all 4 of my grandparents. But the new law, which Congress passed and went into effect in 1929, set an annual limit of 150,000 quota immigrants. That meant that for the entire world, only 150,000 people could come under the quotas. Now, there's a sort of irony here because the Western Hemisphere, meaning both North and South America, had unlimited immigration. You didn't come under the quota. If you were in Honduras or Guatemala or Chile and you wanted to come to the United States in the 1930s, all you had to do was say you wanted to come, and there was no limit at all from the Western Hemisphere. Also, just to make sure we have the complete story, the Chinese had already been excluded entirely under our immigration laws in the 19th century, and under the 1920s law, Japanese were also excluded. But in addition to the overall limit, the law also set country-by-country limits based on the percentage of people from those countries living in the United States at the time of the 1910 census. That's what the first law did. But that actually turned out not to be good enough for the nationalists and the restrictionists in the US Congress, because by 1910, there were already too many Southern and Eastern Europeans living in the United States. So that would have set too high a quota for countries like Poland and Hungary and Romania. So Congress changed the law. So the quotas would be set based on the 1890 census before the Great Migration. As the Deputy Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization explained to State Department consular students in February 1939, and I'm quoting here from Edward Shaughnessy, this method of fixing a quota was merely an effort to preserve the existing complexion of our national citizenry. And it might be obvious, the national complexion, but one thing we should also remember is that in this period, people who were from Italy, people who were from Eastern Europe, who were Slavs, were considered dark-skinned, and therefore they had a complexion that was not desirable in the United States. Now, a lot of you may have known that part of the history because we focus a lot on the quotas and the fact that the quotas kept German Jews and Austrian Jews and Romanian Jews from coming to the United States in the 1930s. But there's an important aspect of this policy that is less well known and that speaks directly to what is happening today. So emboldened by groups such as America First and their supporters in the Congress, and guided by their own hostility to Jews, State Department officials restricted immigration even more than the law allowed. So about 200,000 refugees from Nazi Europe were admitted to the United States, while over twice that number could have been admitted under existing US quotas. So somewhere between 400 and 500,000 refugees from Nazi Europe could have come to the United States under the quotas, but the State Department made sure that that number was something more like 200,000. The most dramatic example is for the German quota. Only once during the 12 years of the Nazi regime was the German quota filled. That was in 1939, when the combined German and Austrian quota was 27,370. For every other year during those 12 years, the quota ranged from 7% filled to 70% filled. So even under existing law, we could have allowed more refugees in. What's important is both how the State Department accomplished this and their stated reasons for doing it. This dramatic limitation on legal immigration was accomplished not by Congress passing laws. In fact, none of the many bills introduced to restrict the quotas or the few bills that were introduced to increase the quotas passed, but by government officials exercising individual discretion. Each consular officer was allowed, under the immigration law, to decide individually whether he, and they were almost all he, so I can use that pronoun, whether he was going to deny a visa to a refugee and an immigrant. And given instructions by the State Department to keep the numbers well under the quota limit, many of the consular officials denied visas. And the reasons that they offered for doing it, the rationale they provided, perhaps even the pretext they provided, was ones that should be familiar to us today. Economic necessity and national security. So during the Nazi era, the State Department officials interpreted a provision of the immigration law to deny visas to anyone who they determined wouldn't be able to support themselves in the United States, which they also determined was pretty much everyone. Most refugees denied visas fell victim to this likely to become a public charge clause. Even those who had American citizens swearing out affidavits promising to take care of them financially. Now here's, and I actually find it kind of amazing, a similar provision is now being considered. The Department of Homeland Security has proposed regulations that would allow federal immigration authorities to reject an application for admission to the United States if the officer determines the individual is unlikely to earn enough to support their family. So it is strikingly similar. And I'm not going to go into it in detail now, but if you have questions, I mean, the amount of discretion and arbitrariness and just pure craziness that State Department officials used during the 1930s to decide that people were not going to be able to support themselves is, I think, important in bearing in mind when we talk about the giving, as this new proposed regulation does, an officer the ability to determine if an individual is likely to be able to earn enough to support their family. Now, once the war started in 1939, State Department officials began to deny visas to applicants who they deemed national security risks, even though the law had no basis for such an exclusion. In 1941, the Congress added that, but when the State Department started doing that in 1939, 1940, and the beginning of 1941, they just decided on their own that they could exclude people because they were national security risks. But that's probably not the most amazing thing about this. To me, what is most striking is the flimsiness of the evidence that they had to conclude that German Jewish refugees were going to be security risks. They relied upon almost I mean, I've looked at, other scholars have looked, I've looked at the State Department files. What's their fear? Why do they think these people are going to be, which is what they claimed, spies for the Third Reich, that German Jewish refugees would be spies for the Third Reich? And you can find almost nothing, right? It tends to be rumors, and I'm not making up either of these examples, but there was in the files a former US ambassador to France wasn't even a current US ambassador to France, said that the German Jewish refugees made up about half of the military spies the French army had arrested after the fall of France. That was one example, one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence was a Cuban ambassador claiming that some Jewish refugees in Havana celebrated the fall of Paris. That was the other example that they used for the fact that these people were going to be spies for the Third Reich. And of course, the latter example has an eerie echo of Trump seeing thousands of Muslims celebrating in New Jersey after 9/11. But German Jewish refugees didn't turn out to be spies. And here's the example. Of the 23,000 enemy aliens who arrived in 1940 from German and Soviet territory, and you have to include the Soviet Union there because, of course, at that point they were allied with Germany. So when you talk about those 23,000 enemy aliens, fewer than 0.5% were taken into custody for questioning, and only a fraction of those were indicted. And then for violating immigration regulations, not espionage. There were almost no German Jewish refugees who were spies. Yet, that provided a basis for a denial of visas based on national security concerns and other concerns. So that meant that just 21,000 refugees entered the United States in the 3.5 years between Pearl Harbor and the war's end. That's fewer than 7,000 a year. And with quotas, again, remembering the quotas from access countries being only 10% filled. So a harsh America First immigration policy left many European Jews trapped in Nazi Europe, condemned to a tragic fate. America First as a philosophy also discouraged the United States from fully recognizing that fate and acting to ameliorate it. As I and many other historians before me have established beyond a doubt, the US government and the American press knew that European Jews were being exterminated as it was happening. I know this is something that people still don't acknowledge, don't accept, don't understand. Again, we can go into this in more depth if you want to, but there's absolutely no doubt about it. The US government determined that beyond winning the war, which they claimed would save many Jews, which was true, the murder of European Jewry was outside their sphere of concern. It was just not, Americans were worried about Americans. Americans were worried about winning the war. Americans weren't worried, or American government was not worried about trying to save a foreign minority group. Only at the end of the war and under public pressure, and again, we could talk about the public pressure part of this, did the US government consider any efforts to save the Jews. American news organizations also took an America First approach. They published stories about the final solution, but almost always treated it as of little importance, buried in the back pages of newspapers. The Holocaust was happening to members of a foreign minority group and other. They assumed their readers cared little about. The America First philosophy, and this really gets into where we are this week, had a subtler and just as noxious effect in another way. Nationalism cowed too many American Jews and made them reluctant to speak up on behalf of their fellow Jews. The United States' promise of religious liberty led them to believe they could be Americans and Jews. But the atmosphere of nationalism, fostered by a determined, angry minority of American citizens, scared many of their leaders into silence. As I write about extensively in my book, Buried by the Times, the Jewish publisher of the New York Times didn't want stories about the extermination of the Jews on the front page. He wanted to be seen as an American, no different than any other American. He wanted the Times to be seen as a newspaper like any other newspaper, not one engaged in special pleading, that was the term that was used at the time, special pleading, on behalf of a minority group the publisher was a member of. The fear of identifying as anything other than an American is one of the reasons the rise of nationalism is so dangerous for Jews. Jews, almost by definition, are both citizens of the countries in which we reside in the diaspora and also part of a larger, indeed, global community. That's part of what it means to be a Jew. That dual status, you are a citizen of your country, but you're also part of the Jewish people, makes us particularly vulnerable to attacks by nationalists of all stripes, including America Firsters. Anti-Semites throughout the ages have seized upon that vulnerability to construct elaborate international conspiracies in which the Rothschilds destroyed Germany's economy, or George Soros finances caravans to invade the US border. So what are the lessons of the last America First era? Well, there are many. I'll only touch on a few. One is don't defend the indefensible. The willingness to make excuses for the Nazi regime, particularly by seemingly well-intentioned Americans, including many American university professors, contributed to the appeasement and ultimately the catastrophe of the Second World War. So that's one lesson. Another lesson, don't allow unsubstantiated claims of economic calamity or security threats to become pretexts for preserving an outmoded power structure. To perpetuate their vision of the United States, too many powerful Americans were willing to offer any explanation, often under the cover of law, and tolerate any cruelty, including refusing to change immigration policies once it was known that Germans were determined to annihilate Europe's Jews. Now, some might object, probably under their breath, that those refugees were different. They were good refugees, but that is not how they were presented at the time. The Jewish refugees were seen as radicals and criminals and greedy and smelly and fundamentally unassimilable in the United States. So that's the next lesson. Don't use those rationales as pretext for covering up your desire to maintain the power structure of the United States. And here's the last one. Don't forget that America First needed lies about the true nature of Germany and its own intentions to thrive and survive. And this last lesson leads me to end with what might be a somewhat hopeful sign from that sad time to this one. The exposure of its underlying anti-Semitism helped to destroy America First as a movement, if not as a philosophy. America First's most celebrated spokesman, the aviator Charles Lindbergh, delivered a speech in September 1941 in which he directly identified Jews as responsible for dragging the United States to the precipice of war. Lindbergh's speech sparked an outcry that discredited America First, the America First Committee, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor dismantled it a few months later. The committee's underlying anti-Semitism revealed that America First was not just a benign movement to protect America. America First was protecting America from those who were foreign, those who were different, those who were other, and doing it based upon hate and fear. So maybe, just maybe, when we recognize the anti-Semitism behind the nationalism, as we have since last weekend, we can reject nationalism as a true expression of the hate upon which it is based. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Leff. Can you please stay with me?
Yes, definitely.
Really, thank you so much for your inspiring words and for your depth survey of the past, even as it speaks to the present. And my hope personally is that the sentiments that you've expressed on tonight gives us all a little bit something more to think about in how we can be better humans, better citizens, and how we can have a better respect for the work that liberal arts practitioners do. To our students, thank you so much, and we're really looking forward to hearing any of your erudite questions. We certainly see faculty from a variety of COLA departments, and if there are any other faculty from other departments, we certainly thank you, but we're always going to give a shout out to the College of Liberal Arts. So without further ado, any questions that you have, we have like about 25 minutes to field any questions that you have. There's no question that's too insignificant, that's dumb or stupid. This is what we do in institutions of higher learning. We're seeking knowledge, we're curious, and we're hungry about it. So with that, I'm going to decrease and allow you to increase by way of your questions. So we'll start with David, and then this gentleman here, and then we'll take the student in the back, and then Lodge, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Leff. Very important lecture, important because difficult. Like you, I have 4 Jewish grandparents who got to this country, made the crossing about a decade before the gates were slammed shut. I'm concerned that many Jews today, too many Jews in my judgment, support and defend the current America First regime. And I'm not talking now about the Jews who were cowed that you talked about and scared, but were there Jews in the 30s, moving into the early 40s, who actively supported and defended that America First movement?
That's a good question, and the answer is yes. The scion of the Sears Roebuck family, who Rosenwald, I'm now blanking on his first name, was initially a member of America First, but once he, and this I think was somewhat out of the concern about interventionism, once he realized that America First did have these roots and was more supportive of fascism, he no longer participated. But there were some American Jews who were in support of it, but and they did do some polling during this period. I don't think they necessarily specifically asked that question, so I don't have a good handle on the numbers. But I would say it's what you find in looking at the records of the American Jewish Committee, the World Jewish Congress, those kind of organizations that were advocating behalf on European Jewry, was more a concern that if the American Jewish community spoke out too much, it would lead to a backlash in the United States, that it would provoke anti-Semitism here, and so they're being careful about how outspoken they were mostly, I think, not because they were sympathetic to America First or they were sympathetic to what was happening in Germany. They, for the most part, were not, but they were very worried about their own futures in the United States.
When you when you mentioned the publisher of the New York Times having that view about coverage, how about the American foreign correspondents who were stationed in Nazi Germany and the surrounding area? I know they wrote dispatches about what they were witnessing. Was that not covered? Was it buried on page 820? What happened?
Well, you have to talk about 2 different time periods. So there's the 1930s and up until the beginning of the war in 1941, when the United States got involved, when there were American correspondents in Germany. There, they were doing a somewhat difficult dance because there wasn't censorship in Germany except of radio broadcasts. So it wasn't as if you were writing a story for the New York Times, you had to submit it to German authorities before it was sent to the United States and published. There was not that kind of censorship. But if you wrote too critically about the German regime, then you face the possibility of being kicked out of the country. So if you wanted to stay in Berlin and do your job and cover the regime, then you had to be somewhat careful about how you reported. But I mean, I don't want to exaggerate that because First of all, once some people left, they went home, they could write whatever they wanted, they published lots of books, so it wasn't as if you were forever censored. The Times also did this kind of interesting thing where they had a good cop and a bad cop. They had a guy whose name was Guido Enderas, who had been there since before World War I. In fact, during World War I, he was the only American correspondent who was allowed to continue to live in the Adlon Hotel, which was a very fancy hotel in Berlin for the entire war. He was considered a German sympathizer. So if the Times, one of the other correspondents, wrote something too negative, then he would go running to the German authorities and try and pacify them. So it was a dance. After we went to war, the American correspondents were interned. They were not able to cover events in Germany. Then the process of reporting was different. Most of the reports about the extermination of the Jews was coming, at least initially, from the Polish government in exile, which was based in London. Which still had people in Poland who saw what was happening, tried to get reports, were able to get reports to London. And the Polish government in exile with the World Jewish Congress tried to get the word out in 1942 once it became very clear that an extermination campaign was on the way. That was the point at which most American newspapers, including the New York Times, decided that this information was something their readers should know. I don't think in most cases they doubted the truth of the information, at least the literal truth of the information, but they just thought, compared to the battles that were going on and compared to the war, compared to other issues, it just wasn't that important. So they tended to put the stories on the inside of the newspaper.
Hi. My question is about, from what you said, it seems like America has had policies in place to limit immigration for a really long time. How does that, in contrast with the narrative that America is like a melting pot and open to immigrants, how does that narrative stand if it's not supported by our policies? That's my question.
So that's a really good question. I think it's that sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, right? So at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, we had a very welcoming policy. I mean, I think a lot of that was for economic reasons. We needed people to come in and work in our factories, and so there was almost no restriction on immigration at that point. And as I said in my talk, over 1 million people a year came to the United States. In the 1930s, we decided to, and into the early 1940s, we decided to have a very restrictive policy, even more than the limits that were put in terms of the quotas. After the war, there were all sorts of questions about what to do about the displaced persons, and there was a lot of fighting about what the immigration policy would be. In the 1960s, we again changed our immigration law to make it somewhat more welcoming. So I think it's like so many things in American history, it's a push and pull. Sometimes we did have the melting pot, the welcoming attitude, and sometimes we did not. I think I should have said that at least one of the rationales during the 1930s for the restrictive policy was the fact there was the Great Depression. There was a great deal of concern that immigrants would come and take Americans' jobs, again, an argument that we've heard. Although there also were arguments that part of the reason we had a Great Depression was the restriction on immigration, that we'd gone from adding lots of people to our country and our economy to having it be very, very restricted. So, and I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to really get into that, but I think that's probably the answer, is that sometimes we are welcoming and sometimes we are not.
So, fabulous talk, really enjoyed it. My question is about how the American firsters relate to a much older American isolationist tradition. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And actually, the irony in this is that probably the greatest chronicler of that tradition was Felix Gilbert, a German Jewish emigre historian whose book To the Farewell Address looked at the roots of American isolationism in Enlightenment thinking, revolutionary ideals. It's a very sympathetic treatment of it. And yet, he, of course, is the sort of person, presumably, the America Firsters wanted to keep out. So, I'm wondering if you could just talk about how America First ties into that larger thing, and, you know, how someone like Gilbert would have parsed the differences.
I haven't read Gilbert's book. I am familiar with him. I think he came as a teenager. I'm right, he was not. So, so I'm not sure. I'm really not sure that I'm completely. It sounds like you'd be better off answering that question than me.
Other questions?
Hi there. Thank you very much for your wonderful and sadly timely report. Can everybody hear me without microphone? I'll put the microphone. Thank you for your wonderful and sadly timely talk. And as I'm sure you know, but maybe our students don't all know that Hollywood, which was very full of powerful Jews, also was very hesitant to talk about what was going on in Hitler's Germany, and they used part of the movie code not to disparage any country, to say they can't talk about Nazism. And also John Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, told them, you know, don't stand out as Jews and so forth. So that's a reference to the earlier period. But in terms of, what was that? Walt Disney was a Nazi sympathizer. But I was also talking about the irony of the Jews not wanting, mostly not wanting to talk about it either. But
it's like the Warner Brothers. The Warner Brothers.
That's true. Yeah, that's very.
I mean, and it's actually, I mentioned that partially because, as most stories, it's not just monolithic, right? So there are people like Louis B. Mayer, who's very hesitant to do it, and then there are others like the Warner Brothers who are more willing to take on the Nazis.
But also, in terms of getting comfortable talking about uncomfortable things, I think there's an added irony about the current situation, which is not being mentioned in MSNBC, CNN, Fox, or New York Times or Washington Post. And that is, in this case, let's say with a caravan from Latin America, people there are seeking refuge in the country that caused, to a large extent, the chaos in that region of the world. The United States has intervened directly and indirectly, as I'm sure you know, for 200 years, including supporting the recent coup in Honduras in 2009. This is Democrats and Republicans over the decades, overthrowing democratic governments, setting up dictatorships, funding or directly CIA death squads. So you have this added thing that is uncomfortable to talk about, but very true, and something that we don't really confront as Americans, our own legacy in that region of the world, which adds this added ironic twist to seeing them as a threat to us, given that whole long history.
Yeah, I would agree. That's a point worth making, I think.
In your talk, it was clear all the parallels. You made it clear all the parallels that exist between what's happening today in this country and what happened in the 30s and 40s. What distinctions do you see that might or might not save us from America First prevailing again?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think, and this is why I sort of ended the way that I did, and this I think is still an open question, so I don't know. But one of the things that I sensed during the 1930s and 1940s was that the assumption that the polling did show during this period that Americans did not want immigrants to come to this country. So you can't sort of suggest that there was really this, wide open arms on the part of the American public. But the other thing that I detected, and I've argued in articles, is that it wasn't very strongly felt. I mean, if you look really carefully at the polling, the degree of anti-Semitism in the United States was very fluctuating. It was sort of broader than it was deep. So to me, that suggests that there was room, and again, this is kind of the what-ifs of history you have to be very careful about. But it suggests to me that there was room to generate sympathy. But what I think is also true is that, to a large extent, the elites, particularly in the United States government, found, I mean, some of it was their own anti-Semitism, and the anti-Semitism in the State Department was overwhelming. I think that's sort of like one of the stories we originally told and then kind of backed away from it. But my sense is that if you look at almost all of the leading figures in the State Department, they weren't just anti-foreign, they were anti-Semitic. And it, you know, it comes from a whole cultural milieu that led to that. So my sense is, to some extent, they use the public and this fear and the backlash as a pretext for putting in place the policies that they wanted. I mean, one of the key sort of dynamics in the 1930s is that not only are you at this point getting German Jews and then Austrian Jews and then French Jews who want to come to the United States, but that's also the moment at which American Jews, people who were born here, were starting to threaten the WASP establishment. They were starting to go to Yale and Harvard and my alma mater, Princeton, although less at Princeton if you were at Princeton. And so you know, and these are kind of the parallels to this era, because that was, those were the people particularly who were seeing the threat. It wasn't farmers in the Midwest. It was the American elite WASP establishment that saw Jews as a threat. And so, to me, to some extent, they were responding to a threat to their world order, and used the public as a justification for their policies. And so I'm not sure, I'm still trying to answer your question, because I think it's a very good and a very difficult question, but to me, you know, sort of the fear of fear was almost more important than the fear itself, to butcher a Roosevelt quote. That the concern that there would be a backlash, right, was what sort of inhibited our policies. So perhaps if we're just more courageous and are willing to take on this and say we're willing to be a diverse society, that's our, what makes America great, again to butcher a quote, that there might be some hope. But you know, I'm not sure. I am really not sure.
You just answered a number of points I was going to ask you about, so thank you. But one of the things that came to mind as I was thinking through on my feet as you're talking through this is that it seems perhaps like in the 30s and early 40s, much of the America First agenda was an anti-Semitic one, very, very focused. Whereas now perhaps it's more of an anti-so many things thing. And I'm curious, I know wandering off of history into politics, but there are a large number of prominent American Jews today who appear to be sympathetic with the overall Make America Great Again or America First agenda. Many of them, people would say, give me a tax cut and whatever you want to do, I'm good. What can you say to prominent American Jews who are right-wing today, which wasn't really much of a thing back in the 30s? What would you say, if we've had several of them in the room, the Adelsons, whoever you want to mention, about their bargain, sort of, it seems to me, maybe like what Hindenburg's bargain was in Germany in the 30s. Hey, we can do this together, there's a bigger picture here, yeah, that stuff is excessive, but there's a bigger, give me my tax cut. What would you say to those Jews who have made their bargain with the Make America Great Again or America First deal?
I think I would look at the demonization of George Soros. And I would say to them, and to some extent, certain elements of the Israeli government as well, I mean, that's the other, obviously, piece of this, is that can't ever be good for the Jews, right? You can't, ever say that there's this powerful, I mean, it so taps into all of the anti-Semitic history that I literally, I can't understand how they can tolerate that. I mean, I can understand wanting your tax cut. I can even understand that, you know, there's a sense that the Trump administration is very supportive of the current Israeli administration and the occupation, which they support, and so that's, you know, part of the bargain that they're making, although, you know, there's a thing about nationalism and maybe a change in Jewish notion of Jewish nationalism. And here I'm going to divert a little bit, but it's something I've been really struggling with and thinking about. But in my talk, I spoke about how part of what it means to be a Jew is to be outside of nationalism, right? I mean, that you're both, and that because we do identify as a people, right? You do feel like, you know, Jews in Iran and Jews in India and Jews are part of you, even though they live in different nations. But it does seem as if there's an element of the current Israeli government that's decided they're just going to be nationalists like anybody else, right? That they're just going to defend Israeli interests and not necessarily Jewish or larger Jewish interests. And that, so maybe, you know, we're post this notion of Jews as not being nationalists, that once you actually get a state, which, you know, from my understanding of the Holocaust, I mean, I was a Zionist before, but after studying the Holocaust, I was reinforced in my Zionism because it seemed as if the powerlessness of the Jews everywhere was partially what allowed 6 million of them to be destroyed. But the Israeli state that I identified with was a state for all Jews. And not just Jews who supported a particular government or particular position, or even, and this is even more to me horrifying, a particular religious perspective, right? So I think that is part of what we're seeing now, is that this notion of what it means to be a Jew may be changing as a result of actually having a state, and it may have taken over 70 years to get here, and for the sort of the peoplehood to be, you know, of all Jews to be what was most important, not just the interests of this particular state, may be dissipating, and so I don't know what that means for I mean, why right-wing Jews think that's acceptable when they're not living in Israel.
I'll wait to see loudly enough. I'm a historian, but instead I want to focus on what you said was a glimmer of hope. When you were talking about America First and the anti-immigrant rhetoric, and I'm wondering both as citizens, but also, which we all are, but also for newspapers, how we can counter what has proved to be successful for countering the kind of anti-immigrant lies that foster an America First agenda. What can newspapers do, or the news media, and what can we also do as citizens?
Well, I think there's a lot to study, and I've only I haven't studied, I've just sort of read it as a normal viewer, of how the media handled this whole caravan issue. I mean, and so I'm sort of holding back a little bit because I'm not sure. I mean, it seems to me that there has been this, that, you know, at least in certain media, not Fox, which is a whole different thing entirely, that there has been a, you know, but they're 7,000 people and they're not actually going to invade the border, and they're oppressed in their home countries, and, you know, the narrative has been countered. Yet at the same time, the narrative is allowed to be out there first, right? And I think this is actually a very important and illustrative example of news coverage, but I hesitate to actually weigh in directly on it, because one of the things that doing the research, particularly on the New York Times and the Holocaust, is that you really need to be systematic and look at all of it and not just kind of take your random impression. So I think it's very important, but I'm really not sure.
Thank you. I'm very concerned about the rise of European anti-Semitism, especially in France. What do you make of it? Why now? Why is this happening to such a degree?
I'm not sure, really. I think it's nationalism too. That's sort of the easiest, but probably the best explanation. In France, France also has this complicated history of can you be a Jew and can you be French? And I think the French answered it more clearly no than the United States did. The United States was more, well, maybe you can, and the French were not really. So you're seeing, with the rise of nationalism in Europe, it's probably not surprising that the expression of it also takes the form of anti-Semitism, and maybe that sort of gets at the question that was asked before. So that to me is the best explanation for it.
This will be a quick question. In your research, did you come across any Trumps with an F at the end in the original?
No. No, absolutely not.
Thank you very much for coming. I have a question that goes back to the media question, and the current movement has access to this widely disseminated network of media outlets. And I know you talked about Lindbergh, and he's the most famous man in America at the time, but beyond Lindbergh, did this movement have major media outlets where they could popularize
that's a great question.
The movement, or was this really more of a backroom?
Well, people paid attention to, and there were also a number of other prominent people involved in America First. So I think that it was treated seriously until it wasn't. I think that and that's why I singled out that moment, because before then, even Arthur Sulzberger was kind of like, how should we view this? And they regularly kind of covered what America First did and treated it not as if it was just sort of, and there were lots of other groups at the Times did not treat seriously, right? So they did feel as if they had to, because of the people who were behind America First, they had to treat it seriously. And I should say, I was actually very surprised that one of the people that I'm looking at for my book on the scholars was an international law professor at Yale, who was very sympathetic to the refugee scholars and was doing everything he could to sort of bring people to American faculties, and yet because he was a pacifist, he was part of America First. So, there was a sense of these are serious people who you need to treat seriously. But then when Lindbergh made that speech and exposed his anti-Semitism, and to some extent the anti-Semitism behind the movement, literally, I'm not sure people have written about this, because I've seen this in letters and I didn't write about it in the book, from Sulzberger and other, there was sort of a discussion among journalists at that point in letters where they just said, okay, that's it. This is an anti-Semitic movement. We're not going to treat it seriously anymore. So, what is also important is that throughout this period, there wasn't one organ like Fox News that was putting out a singular message. There were, Father Coughlin had his radio show. There certainly were outlets that reached large parts of the American public, but none of them, well, I don't want to say none. the Chicago Tribune, the Colonel McCormick was pretty anti-interventionist. So there were some, but not in a sustained propagandistic way, I would say.
Actually, I have a question, and we can probably afford to take about 1 or 2 more questions at the most, and then we will retire. Certainly, you can come up and speak with Professor Leff. I'm sure she'd appreciate meeting you. And then our distinguished guests, our special guests, our faculty, we will meet over in Merckman for post-reception something. But I guess the question that I have, thinking about the students that we have here, and so much of this programming we do also for our students, thinking about your talk, thinking about the contemporaneity of what we're experiencing relative to your talk, what would you have our students do with the knowledge you're expressing today, the pursuit of knowledge in the various courses that they're undertaking in their undergraduate careers? What would you ask them to do with that material and that information, specifically as it transfers to their lives beyond the university as the next generation of transformational citizens and scholars?
Well, that's also a great question. So the first easiest thing is vote. Just vote. November 6th, vote. The next thing, and this is maybe even more self-serving, study history. You know, you can't know where you are unless you know where you've been. And that may sound like, you know, an obvious thing to say and something coming from somebody who studies history, but I so mean it, right? I mean, you can't, I mean, all of this history is what has shaped where we are now. And you can't really understand politics, and you can't even really understand yourself unless you know where you've been, where your people have been, where the country has been. So study history. Did you like that one? Yeah. Okay.
And then one more question, well, 2 more questions, one here and then a student.
Thank you so much for your talk. I particularly appreciated the parallels between the 1940s and today. I work with a group that actually documents the violence in Central American space, and we use that to write reports for news outlets, government agencies, but also for asylum cases. And one of the members of my group is also a member of the synagogue in Squirrel Hill. She was also born in a displaced persons camp in Czechoslovakia in 1948. So when I was speaking with her this week, as you can imagine, it was totally last week. But she said something that kind of stuck with me. She said, you know, we spend so much time documenting the fact that these people are going to die if we send them back, that if we don't let this caravan in, a lot of them will actually die if they actually go back home. She's like, and I think I've come to the realization that just a lot of people don't care. So she said, people don't care that my parents were going to be murdered in this death camp. People didn't care, they don't care today about these people that are escaping violence in Central America. And she said, what I find so heartbreaking is that we've spent so much time trying to document what's happened, disprove the lies about these migrants, do all of this, and just try to have people have real information. But when people have this information, a lot of them just really don't care. And she said, I don't know how to explain to them that we should care that people will be murdered if they return to their country, and that we should care about human life. So I guess my question, which is a big one, is how do you think we could make people care? Like, how do you create sympathy around these groups of people that actually face, that face danger if they return? How do we actually go beyond informing people and actually explain to them that this is something that we should care about?
Well, that's, of course, the biggest question, right? How do you make people care about not just themselves, not just the people they're immediately exposed to, but the larger community? And one of the things that, in some ways, was easier in looking in this 1930s and 1940s period is that I don't think the media really tried, right? So, I mean, one of the things I found in looking at the New York Times coverage is that even after the war, they were so focused on sort of authoritative sources and that there was not a single story about what we would now call a survivor story, right? Where you, even when the camps were open, even when they were in there interviewing people, right, who had just been through this traumatic experience, the New York Times wasn't picking someone out and saying, okay, so where were you born? What happened to you? It was all kind of, what's the government doing and what does this mean for the creation of the State of Israel, and not stories. So in one sense, it's the easy, you know, it seems easy, right? You tell the stories. You make these people real. You don't just treat them as pawns that are part of a system. But then I look at our contemporary period, and I think American journalists are much better about that, right? I mean, you know, Nicholas Kristof, who's a columnist and who'd been a reporter for the Times, I mean, one of the things that he's devoted his life to is telling stories of atrocities where he tries to, you know, find, you know, people and tell you the story that you're going to relate to, and not, you know, even if it's someone who's far away in Africa, you still can understand what they're going through, and yet it may not have made a difference. But I guess all I would say is you still have to try, right? I mean, because that should be what you want to do as a journalist, is make people understand what they're reading. And if you don't tell the truth, if you don't give the background, if you don't, even as the gentleman before said, explain the context, then you're not doing your job. So do your job, and ideally, it might make a difference, but you do your job even if it doesn't, right? I mean, one of the things, even to look at my book, some of the people said, well, you know, the news media didn't report on this because it wouldn't have saved anybody anyway. But that's like, to me, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
See, and this is why I loved your earlier answer about history, because I've always considered the discipline of history as English's first sibling. And so you're talking about telling stories, right? I think part of making that real, right, it's through language and mastering language and identifying the right words to make people feel. And of course, this is what the arts do as well, right? And this is why, for me, when we talk about the Discovery Program and general education, right, it's really important to think about why those categories exist, like the humanities and fine and performing arts, right, and languages and social sciences and the humanities, right? We're all telling stories through different lenses, right, through different ideological lenses, and hopefully we allow people to feel their way back into humanity so that life can be different. So yeah, I really think that the history component and the language component really works well. So if we can conclude with our final student, the final contribution from our student, and then we'll conclude the program.
So I first want to thank you for having the strength to take on the suffering of the millions of people that was required for you to give this lecture. I think that aspect, the psychological aspect of history and research, is overlooked greatly. And I can't imagine how difficult it was for you to gather the information to give this speech. So my question though, the theme of this lecture seemed to be the learning from the past America First generation to refute the current. But is refuting this very recent trend in Trump's rhetoric enough for America in terms of how we treat, as you actually put in your speech, people of different complexion? There's three events that I think about mostly that haunt me with this question, and that's the situation that happened in Aleppo a few years ago, the current slaughter in Yemen, and the recent victory of the far-right candidate in Brazil. I have been appalled by the fact that I have seen about one American official make a statement on the election of the candidate in Brazil, whose rhetoric kind of makes Trump's look very flowery by comparison. And the fact that Trump's main defense in the Khashoggi killing and why he's so adamant and why he wants to believe the Saudis' explanation so much is that he's going to make a multi-billion-dollar arms deal that will contribute to slaughtering the people of Yemen. No one seems to care. Certainly not enough to make that more important of a point as healthcare, which seems to dominate the news as the main reason for why you should vote this November 6th. if, and this comes from my personal political beliefs, but if the best case scenario happens on the 6th and in 2020, and checks and balances are restored to our government, is that enough, or is there so much more work to be done in addressing America's complacency to the suffering of people on the global scale?
Yeah. But we can't even, you know, everything starts from the top, I think. I mean, anybody who's worked in an organization, in a university, in a corporation, the person who is at the top sets the tone. And if we don't counter that tone in some way or another, then I think there's no hope. So yes, of course, there's still an enormous, and you know, and the United States doesn't have a great record on this before Trump, right? I mean, so the Obama administration wasn't particularly good on Syria either, and had a lot of trouble recognizing the humanity of, as part of, you know, this is a struggle we've long had of, you know, how you fit humane interests into foreign policy. That's not a new issue. But if you don't even say it should be part of it, at least we're embarrassed about it, at least we have to have the discussion, at least you don't go and have one of your allies murder a journalist in a consulate and think it's not a problem, then you can't, then you can't even begin to have the broader conversation. So, you know, we need to say that we're not going to allow that before we can then work on the deeper questions, I believe. I'm sorry, that's partisan, but whatever.
Thank you.